So, all right, we've been talking a little bit about the Smart App Launch spec, Carl, as you've been coming up to speed with it. We're doing some work on the next version of Smart App Launch and figured this would be a good time to review the spec. I know you've been taking a look, answer any questions, maybe dig into some of the history behind it. How do you want to get started?
Yeah, I guess I want to confirm that my understanding as I'm building it up is not misguided. I think it was, as I plan on taking over some more responsibilities of this, I want to make sure that my fundamentals are solid, and if there's anything that's confusing about the spec, having my fresh eyes on it might help highlight those. So I've gone through the first few pages and taken some notes on paper, but maybe I thought I'd start with like regurgitating what I've highlighted so far and found useful. So I guess the first caveat is that I'm not an OAuth 2 expert. I mean, I understand the high level. I have never really implemented or set up an OAuth 2 app with a authentication or authorization server. But I kind of have the high level. One of the things that I found helpful to sort of orient my thoughts was the last paragraph of the profile, audience, and scope, where it talks about how this is a mechanism to delegate permissions. And I guess, yeah.
So yeah, and this is maybe the sort of core language around delegation that we put right up front, and it's worth actually looking through this and then comparing it with some clarifications that we've added in response to the Ballot comments. So this is sort of the core of the app launch profile, which is there's some entity which has permissions, that could be a user's permissions, that are going to be delegated to a third-party app. And the idea is when I delegate permissions, it could be a subset of what I can do. So maybe I've got access to a whole bunch of data and I only want to share a limited subset of it. We don't model how the permissions that entity has in the first place. So there's no mechanism to specify what a given entity should or shouldn't be able to do in the EHR. The profile works on top of the existing user and permission system. And as I read this paragraph, it strikes me this is like really similar to something that we quote unquote added in ballot reconciliation to try to provide some clarity there. And so I wonder if I can actually find that one just so we can compare. So there was a ballot comment, maybe this comment here. Can't tell if Jira is acting funny just because it's acting funny, or if it's acting funny because I'm not signed in. But this is not exactly a link. Let me manually type it. 32251. Yeah, so we had a question about this exact topic that came up from Boz in the ballot, and he said in his question, can I grant scopes and still refuse to write some resources? Does this require that we send a list of scopes detailing exactly what and what isn't allowed? And so the paragraph that we decided to sort of add on this front is really quite similar to the one we just read. So there might be an opportunity to reduce some of the overlap here. But this is basically in the page about scopes, which is how we communicate what data access we need. We go into a little more detail here to say the scopes are a way to request access to certain data, but the authorization, the authority to access those data, the root of that authority always comes from some authority who could be an end user, like a patient or practitioner, or it could be some kind of pre-configured policy, like maybe a client is registered and that client is given the authority to access certain data. That's all sort of set up ahead of time. And then the smart scopes are really about saying, okay, given that authority, what subset of the access do we want to delegate? And so a user who tries to grant permissions like user/star.c, that would be saying like, I want to let this app create anything in the EHR. The way to actually read this is not to say that that client can necessarily create every possible FHIR resource. It's more like saying the user's delegating all the right access they have. So the client can write any resources that the user was allowed to write. That's sort of the crux of it. And we don't get into the business of saying or specifying a language for user permissions. We assume that's happening at some lower level of the access control stack. So I think this is consistent with the paragraph that we were just looking at in the spec, but it gets into more of the details and implications for scopes in particular. So while this paragraph is included in the very opening sort of section explaining what the spec is all about, the additional details that we just looked at, they're going to land here in the scopes and launch context page. This is the section of the spec that really goes into the details of that delegation protocol.
Yeah, cool. I think one thing that feels nebulous to me is I don't know what is involved with configuring an authorization server and what sort of capabilities the EHRs currently have and what configuring it looks like. So I sort of have to put that on the back burner and hope that some of the details will come into focus later.
Yeah, I mean, we intentionally leave most of this out of scope, which is to say, you know, every server developer might have its own sort of process for registering apps, and the closest we come to describing that is we just point to this spec here for dynamic client registration to say, you know, servers can consider following that dynamic client registration spec if they want an out-of-the-box solution. But ultimately, this is not what we're aiming to standardize, and we expect there will be some variation in terms of what sorts of data each server asks for at registration time, or how long a registration lasts, or what the upkeep process looks like. The Smart App Launch spec really picks up after an app has been registered. And then we just have a couple of constraints to say, no matter how your registration process works, you've got to have a way to register a launch URL for apps that need a launch URL, and a way to register at least one redirect URL, because all apps need a redirect URI in OAuth. So that's about as much as we say.
Yeah, I imagine that some of the current state of the art will sort of solidify once I'm exposed to it more, and I assume that there are differences in how company A versus company B does it.
Yeah, that's right. And we also, you know, just for reference, on the docs.smarthealthit.org website, we link to some of the vendor sandboxes. Excuse me. So, you know, if you want to get a sense of, you know, what it looks like to register an app with Cerner or with Epic, you know, in general, vendors that are following the ONC certification process will have an open app registration portal or process of some kind, so that people who are developing patient-facing apps, at the very least, can do that for free and in a process that is time-bounded. So there's a very limited amount of stuff that might be sort of checked during that registration step. So it's worth taking a look at what some of those look like, and you'll see plenty of differences across these vendors. And even within some vendors, they'll have more than one on-ramp for registering an app. So on the Epic side, this is all changing a bit. The best entry point at this point is probably fire.epic.com. That's where this redirects. But you can see there have historically been different entry points for registering patient-facing apps versus registering provider-facing apps, and slightly different information that's collected during those processes. And that ties back into those regulatory requirements where, you know, patient-facing app registration needs to be free and meet certain access bars. But this is also evolving pretty quickly. I think we'll see more development happening in these vendor sandboxes over the next year or so. The official deadlines to have that functionality online are basically the end of the next calendar year, so end of 2022.
Okay. So I did want to ask a question at some point, and this seems like a good a time, Benny. When I was reading through the Smart Authorization and Fire Access overview, one thing that I realized I didn't have a full understanding of is the term EHR context is used, and what would you say? I mean, what's a good way to conceptualize how the context or what it means in that usage?
Yeah, so the idea here is there's two ways to launch a smart app. Right now, when we talk about EHR context, we're focused on the EHR launch, which is to say the user has some kind of session in what we call an EHR. And the example that I keep at the top of my head here is like a conventional electronic health record system. That's a provider-facing tool for managing care and records. And they've maybe got that open on a desktop computer. They've got a specific patient chart open, maybe even a specific patient encounter in that chart where they're keeping track of the current encounter as it's going along. All of that state is what we call EHR context. And so when that clinician goes to launch an app, the question is, well, which pieces of that information are going to be important for that app? And so we've identified some pieces of information that are very commonly important. So for example, knowing which patient is open in the EHR. So if the app is launched in the context of a patient chart, it's really important to tell the app which patient. So we call that an example of a launch context parameter. So some of them are sort of pieces of data, a pointer to the patient or a pointer to the encounter. So the app can then fetch a targeted set of resources from the EHR's fire server based on that patient or based on that encounter. So those are what we might think about as sort of context pointing to fire data. And there's other kinds of context which are more visual. So we have an EHR context parameter that tells the app who is responsible for displaying a patient information banner. It's really important that a clinician always knows which patient's chart they're looking at. And very commonly, the EHR will display a patient banner across the top. And then if the app was right below that banner, there wouldn't be a need for the app to repeat that information in the banner, because you'd just be looking at the same information, basically the same kind of header twice, once displayed by the EHR, once displayed by the app. So we have a context parameter that tells the app whether or not it needs to display a patient banner. And that's another example of something that fits in this bucket of EHR context. It's all about what's happening in the EHR surrounding the app, because the app can't see outside of its own little iframe or its own window. It relies on EHR context parameters to know what's happening there.
Okay, and the context as a structure is not standardized, but there are context parameters which serve as handles to provide the necessary bits for the app. And
so the structure is standardized in the following sense. At the end of the day, when the app actually learns the EHR context, that's going to happen as part of the access token response. So, if we go through the sort of overall launch sequence here, this is sort of what's happening when an app launches. It's connecting to the EHR, it's going through this OAuth dance, there's redirects back and forth, and at the end of this process, if the app is granted access, it receives this kind of access token response, which includes the actual token itself and some metadata like the expiration time. And it also can include these additional parameters, which are what we call the launch context parameters. So when the app actually learns this information, it's going to be in a set of standardized key value pairs on this access token response JSON structure. But for an app that's just being launched, we're right at the beginning of this launch sequence. All that is still several steps away. The app can't know the context until it has been fully approved to launch. So early on, what we do is we give the app this opaque handle. It's a URL parameter called launch that we pass into the app, and we say, this is your handle to the launch context. You've got to pass it along to the EHR to sort of tie the session together, so that the EHR knows which launch you're associated with. But the app can't really read that value or make any sense of it. It's an opaque handle at this stage in the launch flow. And once everything has been tied together and the app has been approved, then it will see the actual values as part of the access token response.
Is the handle data, or is it just an identifier?
It's opaque. So as far as the app is concerned, it's a string that it gets as a URL parameter. In some implementations, it could be like a base64 encoded JSON blob. If you're doing it that way as an EHR, that's totally your choice. But you do need to be careful that it's not just data that the app can manipulate. The idea is that that should be opaque to the app, and the app shouldn't be able to change it. So if you're just using some kind of encoded JSON structure, you want to be signing it or authenticating it in some way, so that it hasn't been tampered with when you get it back. But yeah, commonly we've seen either just a database ID being used for that purpose, or a signed JSON web token. That's totally up to the EHR, and we don't try to standardize it.
Okay. So once authorization is complete, the access token, is that access to resources in a Fire server, or is that access to more EHR context, or is all the EHR context that an app needs encoded in the parameters? So
as far as EHR context goes, the way Smart defines this is basically launch time information. So this is a way for an app to learn what the state of the EHR was when the app was launched. It's not a way for the app to sort of follow along with context changes in the EHR. We explicitly left that out of scope, and there's another spec called Firecast, which gets into more of those details about sort of subscribing to changes in a context feed. So the Smart model is dead simple. There's context that exists at the time of the launch, and if the app is approved, it learns that context, and that's one and done. The access token is good for whatever the scopes say it's good for. So very commonly, that'll include, the ability to query for Fire resources. But that same access token can be used for other features as well. Maybe non-Fire APIs that the resource server might also host. Maybe things like smart web messaging, where either the access token or other parts of the access token response are used to make calls to the EHR. And it could also be used for things like Firecast. So if we look at the Firecast spec, just as a quick example here, Firecast defines some OAuth scopes that the client can ask for. So you can ask for like Firecast / I was hoping this example would show me some scopes in it. But anyway, we could see Firecast / some event name, like open or close. So I could see patient open .read might be an example of one. And if you requested that scope, that would allow you to then interact with a Firecast hub. So in general, when we think about these access tokens, they have whatever scopes the user has permitted on them, and they can be used potentially for accessing different sorts of APIs downstream. Although in the Smart on Fire spec, we focus on accessing the sort of regular old Fire REST API as a very common case.
Okay. Cool. That makes sense. So there's a bit of detail about the difference between standalone launch and EHR launch. In practice, do you tend to see one more than the other? Or does it depend on the type of app?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really use case dependent. So when we think about clinician-facing apps that are integrated into the workflow, those are almost all using this EHR launch sequence because it's just so convenient to have a chart open and click a button and launch it. When we think about patient-facing apps, those almost entirely use the standalone launch sequence because that gives patients the most flexibility to pick an app of their choice and connect it to their health records, rather than starting from the health records and having that health record sort of recommend a specific app to them and send them there. Those aren't any hard constraints. You can certainly have clinician-facing apps using the standalone launch, or patient-facing apps that launch from a portal, but the two that I described are by far the most common that we see in practice.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. I guess one other thing that sort of is, I feel not completely resolved in my mind is, you mentioned earlier the implications with, or the flexibility of scopes that can be requested. I think there was an example that was like star.c star or star.r. I can't remember exactly what it was I saw, but I'm wondering the scope vocabulary. There it is, star.c. What would be, I guess I'm wondering, will the scope vocabulary change, or is it pretty much set the way it is, or do we anticipate it to evolve?
So certainly it has evolved between releases of the Smart Spec, and it may continue to do so. In the original release of the Smart Spec, we basically had read and write permissions on every FHIR resource type. And there have been a couple of major improvements, but also changes to the way that works in Smart v2. The first thing that we've done is to break out read and write into the terms FHIR uses for REST API interactions. So FHIR talks about creates, reads, updates, deletes, and searches. That's kind of the CRUD plus S API. And so we have a convention that ties our scopes back to those terms. So rather than granting, quote unquote, write access, you might grant the ability to create, which would be .c, or the ability to create and update, which would be .cu. Or the equivalent of granting all these REST permissions would be .cruds. So you basically start from this whole string and cross out any of the ones you don't want to include, and whatever you've got left, that's what you'd be granting. So if you want to let an app write observations, you can say patient/observation.cu. And that means scoped to the patient that you've been launched against, you can create or update observations. And again, there may be plenty of business logic that stops you from updating certain observations. We don't try to convey all that information here. Maybe there are some historical observations that have been locked, or there's somebody else who is the authority behind them, and all you can do is read them. So the point of this scope language is to convey as well as we can to an app what it expects to be able to do. And this is how it's sort of evolved. What we've done is to write out a mapping. If you're working with what we call the Smart v1 permissions, here's how you should interpret that in terms of Smart v2 permissions to try to ease that transition for folks who are upgrading. But if you previously were using .read in Smart v1, that's what's considered .rs in Smart v2. If you're using .star, that's .cruds. So that's one example of how those scopes have changed in terms of their syntax and their expressive power. The other major feature that we've added in Smart v2 is this suffix here, the ability to attach a list of key value pairs to the end of a scope. And this uses FHIR search param syntax. And that's sort of the trick that we play to reduce a scope from I can do something with all observations to I can do something with observations where category equals laboratory or vital signs, to be able to address finer grained access control use cases. And so we talk a bit about what some of those look like, particularly for category. And we need to make a couple updates that we've got in our ballot issue backlog for these, but this is sort of a rough example of what a category-based scope would look like using this key value search parameter pair. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, one of the first things I was wondering about is, the CRUD's notation seems to be very straightforward and relevant for a fire resource server. But you mentioned earlier that there could be other services that the access token could be used for. And I was wondering if there would be an O, like for other.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things in that space. One is, the very broad world of all kinds of other stuff that you might want to do, and it might not even be bound to a fire resource at all. So saying like observation.o for other, might still be too limiting. So one thing we do is we add explicit support for extensibility in these scopes. We say if you need scopes that aren't part of the syntax that we define here, that don't sort of fit in this model, you can always just add your own scopes and your server can announce support for them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a risk that if you pick a scope that turns out to be something that we introduce later, we could have a conflict, right? So maybe in Smart version 3, we're going to introduce a new scope that might clash with the scope that you've created in your own server. And so we say to server developers, if you want to avoid that risk, we describe two ways that you can avoid it. One is to prefix your scopes with 2 underscores. And we promise we'll never introduce an official scope that starts with 2 underscores, so you'll be safe. And the second thing we do is we say you can use a scope that is a full URL inside of a domain that you control. And we promise, we will never create scopes that are full URLs in a domain that you control. So those are 2 approaches you can take to be sure to avoid conflicts. But in practice, you can also just create your own extensions to the scope language however you want if you're willing to accept what might be some small risk of a name clash down the line. Now, I should say there's one area of the fire spec that we know we would like to address, but we're not currently addressing, which is the fire operations framework. And this is kind of a powerful complement to the fire REST API. It provides kind of a generic RPC mechanism on top of fire. And operations can be at the system level or at the type level. So like I might call on a fire server, /$stats would be an example at the system level to say, tell me all the statistics for your server. But they could also be at the individual resource level. So like /patient/123/ $everything is an operation to export all the data about one patient. And then in addition to the system level and the instance level, there's also the type level. So I can say export all the data about all patients by doing /patient/$export. So it's bound to the patient resource type, but not any specific patient resource. So operations can plug in at all those different levels, and they take different inputs and outputs. That flexibility is really great, but it makes describing operations with OAuth scopes kind of complicated. We've thought about a few different ways to handle that and sort of noodled around on syntax, but we haven't gotten to the point where we actually have agreement on a particular syntax that covers the common use cases without introducing too much ambiguity. So we've put that off as something we want to address down the line. And so when we talk about how this scope language might evolve or how it might expand, that's one area where we know we want to do more in the future.
So does that mean an app should not expect to be able to do patient everything?
It doesn't necessarily mean that. We just don't say anything about it. So for operations that are pure reads or summarized reads, you might be just fine to build a server that uses existing level resource scopes to permit the operation. In other words, if I'm able to read, do a star.rs for this patient, I should be able to do an everything operation on this patient. That would be a perfectly safe and fine conclusion for a server developer to make. And so we don't say anything about it one way or the other, but that's certainly a valid choice.
Okay. Another question I had is, if an app realizes that it doesn't have all the scopes that it wants, does it re-authenticate?
Yeah, or more specifically, we'd say it might reauthorize. There's a few pieces to that story. So one example is this app just totally needs a certain type of data to work. So I use the growth chart app as an example. If you don't give it access to vital signs, it's not going to make a growth chart happen for you. It's just an intrinsic requirement. And so it might ask for access to all your vital signs and to your patient demographics. And if the user denies that scope, the app might go back and say, Carl, it looks like you were trying to launch me. I didn't get access to the data I needed. You could click here if you want to. If you've decided you've had a change of heart and you really do want to grant that access, go ahead and reauthorize here. So that'd be an example where the user maybe explicitly denied a choice, and the app could offer a recovery path. Another example might be what you think of as upgrading just in time, or upgrading your access just in time. We see a really nice version of this pattern on like mobile OSs for your phone. Like you might download an app that you've never used before from the App Store, and then you're using it for a while, and only when you realize you need to take a picture of a document to scan into the app, only at that point does it ask for camera permissions. And so that kind of just-in-time negotiation can be done with OAuth as well, but it's not quite as seamless. Like when you're running that app on your phone, it's literally one modal pop-up. You've got your choices like yes, allow it, only this time, or reject, and you tap one of those three choices and you're done. So that works really well. In the OAuth context, maybe you're building this app that's doing a growth chart, and initially it gets vital signs, and then later on, like once the user is doing some advanced functionality that requires the calculation of a bone age for a patient, maybe then the app is going to ask for access to more observations, like lab results, where it might get bone age testing data. So it could ask just in time to say, okay, Carl, to do that, you're going to have to reauthorize and grant me some more scopes, and then send you back over to the EHR to authorize. It's a perfectly valid pattern. We don't see it a lot. And in part, I think that has to do with the user experience. You might have to sign into the EHR again and go through these steps. It might be more cumbersome than my mobile example where you just tap one button. But I think it's a pattern we do want to encourage the use of. Today, mostly what happens is apps ask for a pretty wide set of scopes up front and either get granted or not. There's one other wrinkle in that story, which is as part of the ONC kind of certification program, authorization servers are supposed to show that patients can selectively approve or deny specific scopes at the resource level. So maybe the app is asking for 5 kinds of resources. I think patients are supposed to be able to uncheck certain ones. So that can lead to some interesting circumstances where an app is granted access but hasn't been given all the things that sort of wanted or expected. So building a robust app really does require looking at what you were granted and comparing it with what you asked for and with what you really need.
Interesting. Okay. Going back to the comparison with the scopes that you might see on your phone, like the just-in-time, do you want to grant permission to this app to access your location? Is there allow for just this one-time analogy in this as well?
So we don't get into a lot of the temporal semantics about how long access is going to last when it comes to the scope language itself. So there's no way to say, I want access to this patient observations for 45 minutes. Like that's not something that you can describe with this syntax. But what you can do is request that the full permissions you're looking for last for something that we call online access, offline access, or neither. So to spell that out, if you don't specify further and you get granted access, you're going to get an access token, and that will last typically a short time. We don't specify exactly how long, but we do have some guidance in the spec about how long it is. I think it's an hour. We say access tokens should have a lifetime no greater than an hour. Servers are sort of free to set that up how they want, and oftentimes it's much shorter than an hour. And so by default, you get that. It lasts as long as the access token lasts, and then you're out of luck. You can reauthorize if you need more access. If you want, you can.
Sorry.
No worries.
Challenges of working from home.
Yeah. So by default, you if you don't specify further, you just get scopes that last as long as your access token lasts. If you want, you can ask for some extra scopes that will grant you a refresh token. So one of those is called the online access scope. And we document that in our scopes page. And what this says is, I want a refresh token that's going to last as long as the user sort of stays connected to the EHR system. And so this is really good for clinician-facing apps that are launching from inside the EHR. The EHR is already maintaining a user session, and it can associate the access with that user session. And when the session's over, the refresh token dies. So I don't know exactly how long it's going to last, but the answer is as long as the user stays online, that's how long I'll be able to keep refreshing. The other scope you can ask for is offline access. This says I need to access, indefinitely. And so from the app's perspective, it means it's requesting access that's going to stay alive. Now, the EHR or the authorization server can have all kinds of policies here. The authorization server could show you, the patient, show you this request and say, do you want to make it last until you revoke it? Do you want to make it last a month or a week or a day? You can pick. And they might push that decision into the user's hands or might apply some kind of policy. From the US certification perspective, there's a requirement basically that offline access needs to have a way to keep working perennially. So as a patient, you can make that connection to your app and it keeps working. In practice, that might mean that you get a refresh token that lasts a few months, and as long as you use it before the end of that period, you can get a new refresh token that lasts a few months. I think that's how they've sort of spelled it out in the certification rules. So that's as deep as we get into the temporal semantics of these scopes. You can imagine doing a lot more, right? Like I want to access your patient demographics forever, but I want to access lab results just for 20 minutes, and we don't get into that kind of stuff.
Okay. Now, with this, so, I mean, as a parent, I'm wondering how does this work when I want to grant access to my kids' medical records?
So also, we don't get into this. We say users have access to certain data, and those users can then delegate that access to apps. So the question about how you got access to your kids' records in the first place, and can you see everything in the records or just a certain compartmentalized subset, all those rules are up to the clinical provider organization to put in place working with their EHR vendors. The Smart App Launch picks up downstream of that. In practice, those rules can be super complicated, especially for older kids, where they have more and more rights and autonomy to be able to maintain some information that's private from their parents.
Yeah, I think I'm going to lose access to one of my kids' records in the near future.
Yeah, and it's not always all or nothing. Sometimes that's the easiest way to implement it, but at least from the regulatory perspective, there might be just certain kinds of information that you can't see.
So maybe loosely, tangentially, you mentioned regulatory requirements, and I wanted to ask earlier about the Cures Act and how much of the recent changes to the IG are in order to anticipate the new requirements in the Cures Act, if at all.
I mean, the interplay between a spec like SMART and regulations is, I'd say, interesting and important territory. In general, we want to make sure that regulations are tied back to real-world capabilities. And so I think there's a really good story here of how we developed the SMART API spec before there was a regulation requiring its use. And then once we were able to show this working with a community of vendors, that became a good target for regulations. And I think that's a really good model. So the way that I look at the features we've added in SMART v2 has basically been based on feedback from the community working with SMART v1. What are the missing features, or what were the areas of ambiguity? So there are going to be places where those might line up with regulatory priorities, but in general, we're not trying to shape a spec to meet a regulation, but there's some cross-play back and forth. Each does inform the other.
Cool. Well, I'm running out of questions for the moment. I know I'm going to hit more as I dig deeper into this. Are there any things that you feel like I should know right now that we haven't talked about that are sort of introductory and low level?
No, I mean, I would say it's worth just sort of reading top to bottom. The number of pages in the spec is pretty small. It's basically these 5 pages. And the first
Mm-hmm.
two are kind of the big ones. These are the ones that we've been focused on in this conversation, but this is also where almost all the content sits. The other
Mm-hmm.
pages are by comparison quite short. So it's worth reading through there. And then it's also worth taking a look at the bulk data specification, particularly the piece that deals with what we call backend services. And so just to make sure we're on the same page on this one, there's this page in the bulk data spec about authorization. And the plan is to migrate this page into the Smart App Launch spec, because it's not really particular to the bulk data export use case. It's more of a general pattern for clients that need to connect to servers and get access tokens. So I would read this page top to bottom as well. My guess is that we won't import this verbatim. We'll wind up creating a section in the Smart App Launch spec that deals with authentication, and part of this will live there. And maybe a section that deals with service to service or backend services authorization, and part of this will live there. We'll have to be thoughtful about how to break that down. But step one, read through this, and we can come back and talk about questions about how it works.
Okay, and the smart channel in Zulip is where most of the discussion around this takes place.
Yes, although there's a channel dedicated to bulk data as well, where there's certainly discussion on this particular profile. And it's worth, if you're not subscribed to the Inferno channel, that's where a lot of the compliance testing discussion comes up. And that's really where the rubber meets the road, because you'll get questions like, well, my server works in this very particular way, and the official test suite that's testing for ONC certified EHRs makes this assumption. How do we resolve it? And that's really great for ironing out ambiguities in the spec, because there's sort of tests that are going to give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and there's a very strong interest in making sure we understand the edge cases there.
I think I was lurking in Inferno, but it's not pinned to the list of saved streams, so I'll do that.
Cool. All right, well, this has been a good session. I'm going to hit stop on the recording for now, and we can follow up maybe next week.